before the march, the idea of the march was so threatening that that the press was extremely negative. So before leading up to the march, the focus of the press was how this was going to turn into a riot, and there was all this. Every newspaper article after article after article talked about sort of preparations, kind of military preparations for the march. So there were descriptions of how they were literally staging the military outside of Washington with helicopters ready to bring people in the event of a riot. There was just all of this sort of negative press, and then there wasn't a riot. So that sort of lowered expectations to the point that the press was like, oh, this was fine, and people were nice, and it went off fine. And so that was sort of the tone of a lot of the press. In terms of public opinion polls, there wasn't actually a big shift in public opinion polls. So it tended to be the people who supported the civil rights movement and the goals of the civil rights movement before the march were sort of more supportive of it after the march. People who opposed it were more opposed. And there was actually a lot of really horrific violence in the days after the march. So people were attacked on their way back. Buses on their way back were shot at on the way back. Both buses going both north and south. I write about the day after the march. A black couple in Philadelphia had bought a house in a suburb, and they planned to move into their house the day after the march on Washington. I think kind of coincidentally. But when they showed up, their house was surrounded by a white mob who threw bricks at them, scared them away. They actually went back, as one newspaper said, to their apartment in the city of brotherly love. And they came back the next day and found their house completely destroyed. The people had gone in and tore out the entire heating system. They had spray painted the entire house. They actually went and lived in the house that night. They went under military guard. And they went and they stayed in the house for several months until the husband had a nervous breakdown, and they left and they moved back. So that there were like the week after the march, there were protests. There was a mass march in downtown Chicago against an open housing ordinance of white families calling for the resegregation of their communities. So in that's something I think that we have this image of, like Martin Luther King gave this speech, and it was a great speech, and it convinced everybody that he was a nice guy. That actually was not at all the case. And it sort of, in many ways, hardened. I think what it did do, though, was that it unified a political bloc that was powerful enough to advance the Civil Rights Act. So it unified, again, people who had already kind of been on the side of I think the biggest actually shift was the AFL-CIO, so the union movement, which the AFL-CIO supported the goals of the civil rights movement. They didn't support the March on Washington. The leadership of the AFL-CIO thought that marches were dangerous and they didn't want to support that. But after the march, they took a huge role in pushing the law through Congress. So it meant that sort of supporters who were kind of on the fence were really rallied behind the march. But in terms of the general public, it was not actually, it did not have that sort of shifting effect.
There's a question over here.
How do you think the NAACP presented its Christian virtues in this movement?
You want to talk about it?
I didn't know anything about that.
But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, what do you mean by the Christian virtues of the NAACP?
Well, the fruits of the Spirit. How were the fruits of the Spirit portrayed? Nonviolence, snake, and just, well, I can go on. I can answer
Okay.
one question if you want me
Sure, yeah, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think that Jesus and Martin Luther King were on the same page. Well, in the Bible it states that the Lord he doesn't like oppression and inequality and discrimination and the like. Well, it's fascinating how one man can promote a movement of such. I mean, get everybody involved on the same page. And,
So the reason I asked was that because I mean, the NAACP wasn't particularly a Christian association or organization, but you're right about Martin Luther King. And I think one thing that's really fascinating to me about the organization of the mobilization of a movement was the way in which it took actually people of a really wide variety of beliefs. And I think the sort of the movement used the sort of Christian arguments about brotherhood, about people being all the same in the eyes of God. And many of the people who led the movement came from Christian backgrounds. I mean, even Athel Randolph, who was an atheist, he was a socialist. His father was a preacher, and he always talked about how he sort of gained his sense of justice from the Bible. And he referred to that repeatedly. So these were people who were very familiar with Christianity, and many of them, like Martin Luther King, were sort of motivated primarily by their religious faith. Others, took a very wide variety of beliefs. But I think that one thing that was really amazing about this movement was that it was able to unite people across that diversity.
Absolutely. The Lord says to love your neighbor as yourself, and if one smite you on thy right cheek, turn another. I mean, it's evident in His Word alone that these fruit of long suffering, patience, kindness, gentleness were used in His movement, in His march, and just in this time period alone. So I just think that we need to give credit to the Lord, because if it wasn't for His Word, I mean, who do you think who would have an idea of this change, of this progress?
Also very humanistic attributes and values.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually.
Can you turn on your microphone? Or is it not on?
I have a little closer now.
It's on, you just have to.
Well, what I just said was that I just really feel like a lot of the movements now, both historically but also currently, are really driven by humanistic concerns. And you can frame that however you want in whatever religious avenue you want to take, but they're also very just human. Community, taking care of each other.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a fair question. I don't know if we have time to answer this question, but I'll throw it out and see where it goes. Having just gone through the exhibit downstairs, having just seen the pictures, having heard you talk, I'm drawing parallels, or trying to draw parallels, and I'm not doing a very good job, between 1963 and where we are now, between the March on Washington and various Black Lives Matter things now, or just the general social milieu in 1963 with, policemen turning fire hoses on people, and what's happening now with people being shot. Any comments from either of you as far as parallels, similarities, or dissimilarities? You know, how can we make sense of this? How can we use what's in the exhibit down there to kind of figure out where to go today?
Well, one of the things that I'm becoming more increasingly aware of is what feels to me to almost be a rise in vitriol, in vitriolic language, and phrases, and this kind of incendiary fear, terms like, you know, let's build a wall, let's frisk and search, let's segregate. We have to stay away from each other rather than, you know, for God's sake, all of our blood is red. You know, if we could just kind of get there, I think it would be better. So in some ways, I feel like what happened, you know, 1963, 1863, 2016, yes, we've made some movement, but I certainly don't think that we're post-racial. And I think the issues are all still very much demand our attention, a very thoughtful attention and care.
Yeah, I agree about the vitriol. I guess when I published this book in 2013, and when I would speak about that, I would say that I think that one important difference between now and the 1960s was the degree to which overt racism has been discredited. So that in the 1960s, you know, George Wallace could run for president on the argument that white people are better than black people, that segregation is good and it has to last forever. These are not things that in 2013 somebody would get very far running for president. Since then, I think things have changed, and I think just in that 3-year period, we've seen a sort of not a return to that sort of open embrace of white supremacy that really was. I mean, in the 1960s, you could gain a lot of political support through an open embrace of white supremacy. And I think we've seen just in the past couple of years, really since 2015, I think a revival of that type of rhetoric that shocks me. I do think that in many ways, I think it's important to remember the similarities between the issues faced today. I mean, one thing that I think we forget often is the centrality of discussions of poverty and economic injustice in the 1960s, you know, which I think remain really central to the problem today. And so that I think is a parallel. I think we've seen in some ways, you know, the persistence of segregation I think in very different forms, but in some ways has gotten certainly in terms of the number of people living in segregated communities, the number of children attending segregated schools is actually much worse now than it was in the 1960s. So I think there are a lot of important parallels that, you know, again, I don't think it makes sense to sort of use history as a roadmap to the future, but I think we can, well, I don't remember who said history, it doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
I have a question for each of you. Petronella, you did say earlier on that it wasn't a comprehensive overview of African American photographers. So how did you actually select the ones that you actually used during your presentation? And then for you, William, you talked about the importance of anniversaries and why we celebrate them and how we look back at things in retrospect. And my question to you, probably as like a historian, not to, that you can predict the future, but looking back 50 years ago, we saw people marching in the streets and holding signs, and now we're 60 years later, and we're still in a modern world, and that's still the practice. And one thing that I would probably say is concerning, if I'm middle America, middle class white person, that is seeing Black Americans continue to say that they're oppressed 60 years later by causing civil unrest in the streets, if you will. Isn't that almost instilling a belief that this should be happening? If we're moving 60 years beyond the point and it's continuing to happen, it's almost solidifying the correctness, and it helps increase the idea that white privilege doesn't really exist. It's almost, you've always been complaining about white privilege and saying that it exists. You did it 60 years ago. So how do we move forward beyond that to get to a point where we recognize as a people, and maybe there is some truth to this. Maybe there is a reality. So yeah.
I will answer the image question. There's a wonderful compendium by Deborah Willis. I brought the book. It's also in the library downstairs, and she's a wonderful Black historian. It's called Reflections in Black. There's a number of really good compilations of African American work in different time periods. Aperture magazine just focused on their summer issue. It's called Vision and Justice. That's another good resource. I did a lot of reading about labor. I approached this not only from economic employment issues, but obviously I did the broader scope, all the while realizing that we are only speaking about African Americans here, rather than Native Americans or other quote-unquote minority groups. So it was just a tumble-through process. I obviously have a very specific eye, so there are a lot of images that I'm particularly personally drawn to, whether it's the actual image or the backstory of the image. I also wanted to just hop, skip, and jump through 153 years. And I'll tell you, there's a hell of a lot more images that I've edited out than what I showed you tonight. So I always used to say, it's easier for me to talk about Gordon Parks for 6 days than 20 minutes, you know?
I'd like to talk about Gordon Parks. So that's a really, I guess the answer to the question about how do you, so your question, as I understand it, is if we keep pointing to these periods in history and sort of the repetition of a pattern, either that means that you can't get rid of that pattern, or that pattern's just kind of natural. Is that
Yes, correct.
right? And I guess that's why I think it's really important to understand the ways in which patterns of inequality change over time. And so we're not living in the 60s. We might be living in a racially, stratified country. We might be living in a white supremacist country, but it's not the same white supremacy as we had in the 60s. And Petronella actually talked about one important difference is the patterns of immigration that have happened since the 1960s. That mean that, that Black people aren't actually the biggest non-white group in this country, right? And so, that matters. It also means that in the 1960s, there were the big bodies of Mexican immigrants, for example, were working in agriculture, were mostly in the Southwest, in rural areas. Now you have huge Mexican American and Mexican immigrant communities living alongside African American communities in almost every major city in the country, alongside Asian communities. That creates a very important political difference from the 1960s. So we still have white supremacy, we still have racism, but there's a different dynamic. I think another important change has been what's happened to working class white people, who since the 1960s have seen their economic situation decline steadily. We've seen a situation in which the death rates of working class men, white men, is now on the rise. It's one of the few places in the world where that's actually happening, in the wealthiest country in the world. So again, this doesn't mean that we're living in a post-racial world. We're certainly not. But we're definitely living in a different world from the 1960s. And that means that, and I guess the reason that I think there's two reasons that I think are important to be aware of those differences. One is that in part those changes were created by political activism. So, the civil rights movement didn't erase racism, but it did a lot. For example, the civil rights movement banned employment discrimination based on race. It banned employment discrimination based on gender, which the white women benefited from that. But it was the largest single group of beneficiaries of that law were white women who now it's illegal to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their gender. That's a really different political situation from the 1960s, in which it wasn't just legal, it was completely accepted to discriminate against somebody based upon their race or their gender. So I think it's important to recognize that political activism, while we still face many of the same problems, it's not as if it's just been a sort of stream of failures. Because if it hasn't worked, then we might as well just go home and give up. Right? And so I think it's important to recognize that things have worked and there's a reason to continue to try to change things. But I think it's also, if we are going to understand the problems that we face today, I think it doesn't, and this is part of what my point is about history, not being enough. Do you know that if we free every Black and Latino prisoner in the United States would still have, by far, the largest percentage of its population imprisoned of any country in the world. So that means there are a whole lot of white people in prison, right? And in fact, the problem of mass incarceration is in large part a problem of racism, but it doesn't explain the whole problem. So understanding the problems, I think, require us to understand that there's been these changes. And so that's what I would say, that I think it's important to go beyond the sort of superficial. We often hear that there's more Black people in prison than were enslaved, right? That's true. There's a lot more people in the United States than were alive during the Civil War. I think it's important to understand not just the history, but the present.
We have an opportunity for one last question. Okay. No one? All right, there's a couple of things that we need to do.
All right, sure. I want to thank our speakers again tonight for coming here and teaching us and being with us. And thank you all for being here tonight too. This exhibit will be here until November 4th. I just want to highlight the fact that Metropolitan State University is the only site in the state of Minnesota that's hosting this event or this exhibit. And we're one of 50 of them across the nation. So we have a great opportunity to see this. Also that the permanent exhibit is in DC in the Smithsonian. I think it will be permanently housed in newly opened National Museum of African American History and Culture. So what we have here is a real gift. Along the way, in the next 6 weeks, we have other events and opportunities for you to participate and bring your friends and family here too. One of them is the digital storytelling competition that there are flyers out on the table and the chance to win a $500 Amazon card for a student who submits this. And then the winners and honorable mentions will be highlighted at the November 4th event, which is the closing event. So think about that. And then also in a couple weeks, October 17th, Monday, October 17th, in the first floor of the library, Professor Raj is going to host learning circles. So if you have that time open, please attend. And I know that there will be all other classrooms and courses that are going to be there that night. So thank you again. More flyers outside. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks.